So Dori has been on banner for a little bit now, and if you're like me, you might have found her kit a little underwhelming or even disappointing, which I go into further detail about in our previous video. So if you want to check that out, feel free to check the link in the description below. But you might still be asking yourself the question of how do I build her to not just be a worse Kuki Shinobu? And after some testing and messing around with some different artifact sets, I think I've landed on the answer for you. By the way, my name's Blossums and I do a bunch of different Genshin Impact content, and I do the extremely original and creative idea of doing build guides pretty often. So if you want to see more of those, feel free to leave a like and subscribe to the channel, as it helps me out a ton and I really appreciate it. But without further ado, let's talk about Dori. So Dori is actually a little bit difficult to build, and we'll go into why a little bit later, but first let's do a brief overview of her kit. And when you read her kit, the way it operates, you'll see that it's centered around the elemental burst. And the way this elemental burst works is that you cast it, and then you throw a Jinny on the field. It's a little lamp. This Jinny then connects to your character with an electro tether. That electro tether will continuously restore HP based on Dori's max HP, continuously regenerate energy, and affect the character with electro, which is very important because that's just going to be bad in some encounters, so you will have to account for that. If you're fighting like a pyro person or something, then that's going to be a very bad element to have on you. It also deals electro damage to enemies that pass through this tether every 0.4 seconds, which is pretty quick, and you might be like, oh wow, that might be good, but then you'll realize that the damage is actually very low and negligible, so don't worry about that. However, the healing is very good. It's 10% of her max HP plus 1200 here at level 8, which is very nice, solid healing. You're going to be able to heal up your team to full relatively easily. The energy generation, on the other hand, is not that good. It is there though, and it is certainly helping your team, but it will only be applying to the character that is currently on the field or tethered to the elemental burst. Same with the healing. And then the biggest downside to the elemental burst is the 8-second cooldown, which is a little unfortunate, but overall I haven't found myself missing her elemental burst all that much, or feeling like I need more healing than the healing that she's actually providing. She also has an 80 energy cost here, which isn't so bad because the rest of her kit is actually very good at funding this elemental burst. And the way that it actually accomplishes this is through the elemental skill. And the way this elemental skill works is you use it, you deal electro damage, it shoots off 2 extra shots that deal electro damage, and these scale fine and dandy. The cooldown here is nothing too bad, but the reason this is so good at funding her elemental burst is through her passive. And the way this passive works is that when the troubleshooter shots from after sales service rounds from spirit warding lamp troubleshooter cannon, that's a lot to say. Basically the second part of the elemental skill that I was mentioning before, the 2 extra shots, when that hits opponents, Dori will restore 5 elemental energy for every 100% energy recharge possessed per spirit warding lamp, basically just meaning that it's only going to happen once per E skill. And that's actually important because not only is this generating some flat energy for you, you're still going to be catching the particles from using the elemental skill like you would normally, meaning that this is very efficient at generating her elemental burst because you'll also be investing into energy recharge here. So getting that 80 energy cost burst is no big deal, and you'll be able to do this quite often via her other passive that reduces the cooldown of her elemental skill whenever you trigger elemental reactions with the elemental burst tether there. So that's actually quite nice. She's very good at funding herself, and she's going to be generating a little bit of energy for the team and healing them pretty effectively. And I've already gone over my thoughts on this kit like I mentioned in the previous video before, but she is pretty good at healing here, and the energy just isn't that much, but you'll realize that's kind of the goal of her kit, is to heal characters and generate a little bit of energy. But it makes it a little difficult to build her in any way that doesn't just make her a worse Kuki Shinobu who doesn't have nearly as much downtime and is actually quite good now with the addition of Dendro due to the way her kit just functions in general, scaling off elemental mastery and stuff. So how are we going to build her in a way that takes advantage of this kit and what it's trying to do, augments it properly, and doesn't make her just a worse Kuki Shinobu? Well, I do think I have the answer. And let me just say that I not only plan to go over my build, but I also plan to go over a very support focused Dori that I think a lot of content creators are pushing, as that is a very solid way to build her as well. So let's talk about that first. We'll start with the artifact sets, and we're actually going to start with split sets because that is going to be the best way to build her in terms of consistency. Using a 2-piece of Emblem of Severed Fate and like a 2-piece of the Tenacity of Millith is fantastic because you're just getting free stats that she's going to utilize. A lot of you might be asking why not the 4-piece of Tenacity of Millith, but remember it only works off the elemental skill and lasts for 3 seconds, so you can use it and you will be getting its benefits at a pretty decent uptime, but you're not going to be keeping it at a 100% uptime like you would with many of the other characters that can take advantage of this, and I just don't think it's worth it. But if you are just trying to heal as much as you can or be as consistent as you can with Dori, you're mostly just going to want to augment your artifacts with the best 2 pieces that are going to benefit you, like Emblem of Severed Fate, Tenacity of the Millith, 2-piece of Ocean Hue Clam, or even something like the 2-piece of the Maiden's Beloved. Getting as much healing effectiveness as you can to heal your team the most effective way that you can is definitely not a bad way to go. But what route am I going? What am I using? Well, you might have noticed if you're paying attention to what is equipped to who, I'm actually going with the 4-piece of Gilded Dreams. And this is because it gives you elemental mastery, and then depending on the elemental types of the characters in the party, you're going to either be receiving attack for same element characters, or you're going to be receiving 50 elemental mastery for characters with a different elemental type. And the interesting part about this is that you can also trigger this while the character isn't on the field. So what this is accomplishing for Dori is it's giving her elemental mastery and attack percent, which are stats you're not really going to be investing in your main sets, and I don't think you really should in your main stats. And this is important because this is actually going to turn her from just a healer and just an energy supplementer to actually contributing to your reactions, mostly the transformative ones, as Electro does have good scaling with its transformative reactions, and having her contribute to those with this set, as well as getting some attack, which will be important for another reason we'll go over later, actually isn't too bad, and I think this is my favorite set on her. But it certainly isn't the only one. You do have other 4-piece options. 4-piece Ocean Hue Clam actually is okay. She will get a little bit of that additional damage via its 4-piece over healing effect there. You could also try to use something like Noblesse Oblige, the 4-piece here, because her burst does last 12 seconds. But remember, it doesn't have a 12-second cooldown. You're still going to have to wait 8 seconds. There are just characters who use Noblesse better, so I really wouldn't recommend it. And then something like Maiden's Beloved is of course going to be okay as well, giving you that extra healing effectiveness, and incoming healing is always wonderful. So if you're just trying to lean into her healing as much as you can, stuff like that is going to be fine. There is also one other set that I think is kind of funny, and that's the Thundering Fury, because it plays into this weird like power fantasy for Dori, to where you can lower her cooldown on her E skill more than it already is getting lowered from her passive, so you could try to use it like a ton or something. I don't think this is the best way by any means, but it definitely lends itself to be an interesting or funny build for her, and I just wanted to mention it. So we mentioned that we're utilizing Gilded Dreams in order to make her an effective team player, and giving her plenty of elemental mastery, giving her a little attack if you have another Electro character, that's actually fine. We'll get into why in a second, but the extra elemental mastery is also fantastic, and the main stats that you're really going to want to take advantage for Dori are going to be HP percent, and crit rate, in my opinion. However, the crit rate could be healing bonus. It's really going to depend here, and we'll talk about why in a second. But HP percent is definitely going to be the most effective. However, you're only really going to be able to go into double HP percent if you still have some good energy recharge substats, as regardless of whether or not you have a good energy recharge weapon, you're still going to want some good energy recharge on your substats just to make sure you're getting that burst off cooldown and contributing to the passive that gives you that flat energy on her elemental burst. So if you don't have good energy recharge, if you're not hitting like a 180 or 190 to 200 mark, then I would recommend maybe doing energy recharge on the main stat here, which is going to lower your healing but enable some consistency. Now, if you are just going for pure healing Diona, healing bonus here is fine. However, if you just have good crit rate through your substats alone and it's consistent enough, like 40 to 50-ish%, then do healing bonus here too. That's fantastic, because the point of crit rate here isn't to make sure that we're dealing a bunch of damage with Dori, it's to make sure that we're generating particles via something like the Favonia's Greatsword, which, spoiler, is going to be the weapon for this build, because that is going to be the best way to fund energy to your teammates. There's also an argument here that if you have good enough HP percent and energy recharge substats, that elemental mastery is a pretty good option here too, to further increase those transformative reactions that we mentioned before. But it certainly isn't the focus, because remember, she's not like Kuki where she gets additional scaling through elemental mastery. It just helps her with those transformative reactions. So double HP percent and crit rate or healing bonus, I think, are the way to go. You can do a 3 HP percent if you really want to. But ultimately, what main stats you're going to be using is very dependent on what substats you have. And then the top priorities of substats that you're going to want to be looking for are going to be things like energy recharge, HP percent, elemental mastery, attack percent, and crit rate. All of those 5 are going to be very important to your build. Looking for as much of those as you possibly can is really going to be the route to go. And I mentioned crit rate only here, not crit rate or not crit damage, because I mentioned before we're trying to use the Favonius Greatsword, and if you can get good crit rate substats without a main stat crit circlet, then that's fantastic. You're going to be able to heal even more with something like a healing bonus. So that's why I mention it here. But if you are using a crit rate main stat, you don't have to worry about it nearly as much. Just focus in on things like energy recharge, attack percent, and elemental mastery. And I'm only saying attack percent because we are trying to use her crit rate as much as possible, so you might as well contribute a little bit to her attack. Why not? It's just a little bit of extra damage, but ideally energy recharge and elemental mastery and crit rate are going to be your priorities over something like that, as well as something like HP percent. But since we're likely having 2 HP percent main stats, HP percent isn't an option on your substats there, so you'll be looking for that on things like your feather and flower. Now, I know that's a little complicated, and that's because Dori is complicated. As I said in my previous video, if you want to take advantage of her kit the best you can, you're going to need some pretty tight main and substats for her to make her just not a worse Kuki Shinobu. Alright, moving on to weapons, and I did spoil it earlier, we are using the Favonius Greatsword, and I think this is the option for Dori. And the reason for this is that crit hits generate elemental particles that are neutral particles for the team, which is phenomenal for her. This can happen every 6 seconds, which you're likely going to be doing off a cooldown because you're probably lowering the cooldown on her E skill enough in order to use this as much as you can. And this is going to be a huge contributor to funding particles to your team, not only through her elemental burst, but through these neutral particles, and it gives her energy recharge, which she wants to fund her elemental burst the most. So I do think this is the best option on her. However, it is not the only option. Of course, something like Sacrificial Greatsword is also a pretty cool option, and if you are going for that kind of like weird build that I talked about earlier with Thundering Fury, Sacrificial Greatsword is going to be the best one for that one in particular. But it does have less energy recharge. However, it does have a higher base attack, but does not contribute to generating energy for the team, like I mentioned previously. Something like the Bell is also an option, and the passive here is cool, but it's not cool for Dori. It's a shield that only applies to the character who is holding the weapon, that has a 45-second downtime, and then also increases their damage by 18%, which is cool, and that's a refinement rank 3 here, by the way. But as I said, this only applies to the character holding the weapon, so while the passive is cool and the substat is good for Dori, it's just not a good weapon for her. You can also utilize something like Katsuraga Kiri Nagamasa because that does increase your skill damage and generate some energy while taking a little bit of energy, so that's pretty cool too. Energy recharge substat, really good option, especially if you don't have something like the Favonius Greatsword. I think this might be the second best in my opinion. Even though it's not generating those particles for your team like we really want to, the particle generation of Favonius Greatsword is just extremely valuable and I think integral to making her a functional part of your team that doesn't just make her a worse Kuki Shinobu. Alright, and we're going to do something we don't kind of normally do, which we're going to summarize kind of this build, because this is a pretty complicated build in the sense that you just need a lot of different stats on a lot of different places, and I'm going to put some benchmarkers for you guys to shoot in order to make a build like this operate. And I think some of the markers you're going to want to hit on Dori are things like 30k max HP, around 200 elemental mastery, while hitting a 40 to 80 crit rate to crit damage ratio, and nearly 200 energy recharge. 180 is a solid place to be as well though. And I think those are the kind of markers that you're going to want to hit, because that is going to make it to where she's doing solid enough healing to keep your team healed while still doing solid enough elemental reactions in order to contribute to damage and be able to crit to actually activate the Favonius Greatsword and generate that energy for your team. And when Gilded Dreams procs, keep in mind you're going to get about 150 elemental mastery if all of your teammates are a different element. If you only have 2 different elements, then of course you're only going to be getting 100, but that is fine, and I actually think that's a pretty good option too. We'll go over that when we talk about some different team pairings. But overall, I think those are pretty good benchmarks to hit in order to take a build like this and be efficient with it. Now, if you want to just be a better healer than a build like this is going to provide, then healing bonus is going to be the way to go. Yeah, it's going to fix it right there, and then maybe you'll change your weapon if you don't have consistent enough crit rate. That is fine. If you just want her to be a consistent healer that heals really well, that is a-okay. But if you want her to be more than a worse Kuki Shinobu, then I think you're going to want to try and do things like this. And before we move along, I will go over each and every one of the artifacts I have here in order for you guys to get a grasp of how I achieved the stats that I have and to potentially help you build your Dori in order to get her to those benchmarks I talked about. And that's not to mention that I don't think this build is even in its final form. This is a C0 Dori. Once you get some constellations, I think this particular kind of build pops off even further with Dori. And the reason for that is that her constellations actually kind of contribute and lend itself to a build like this. And what I mean by that is that the first one here, you get an extra shot on your E skill, and I believe that is an extra instance of Electro application. Please correct me if I'm wrong. Nobody corrected me in the last one, and I'm still going off of that belief. Then her C2 also contributes to her Electro application, which is going to be important because as we're having that elemental mastery, and she's going to be proccing those reactions or at least setting them up. When you move on to her C4, you get that incoming healing bonus that we're missing from having a crit rate circlet, as well as giving energy recharge to the team when they're below 50%, which is really going to come into play when they're sucking in those Favonius Greatsword particles, getting even more energy than the awesome energy it provides. And then the C6 is just a nice way to give her some additional Electro application and heal the entire party and not just a singular person that's on the actual field. And I really think this does allow her to be her own unit and earn her place on a team. This is a great build in order to allow her to have some solid damage while generating a ton of energy for the party and being a consistent healer. So while having split sets and healing bonus and all that jazz is really good in order to make her a very good healer who does very big healing ticks, I think this is the best way to build Dori in order to make her an effective teammate that isn't just a worse Kuki Shinobu. Now, as for this next section, we're going to be talking about different pairings for Dori, and I'm not going to be recommending you a bunch of different team comps, as I think that could be its own video, as Dori can be a little bit hard to slot in some different teams. But I am going to give you some tips here in the sense that elemental resonance is actually very beneficial to Dori and how she's built, namely things like the new Hydro Resonance, increasing your max HP by 25%, increasing her healing. And then something like the Electro Resonance is really good because it's going to be generating some electro elemental particles, further increasing everybody's uptime on their elemental burst and contributing to the factor that she is a very good battery for the entire team. So I think these are resonances that you might want to hone in on. The other ones aren't bad or anything, but I think these are very good for her, and some of the character pairings that she can go with really benefit from this as well, namely characters like Yelan or Ayato, who already scale off HP and are going to benefit from that resonance as well. Dori can slot in there, and then maybe you could do something like the Dendro Traveler, who's going to not only give elemental mastery to the party, but is also going to allow things like Hyper Bloom, which I think Dori is pretty good for, to actually happen. Also wanted to talk about how I mentioned that the elemental burst applies electro to you and how that can be bad for your team. I did also want to mention though that when you apply it to yourself, it isn't nearly as bad. The reaction still happens, but it doesn't seem to stun lock you very hard like it does when an enemy applies the element to you. So if you do something like Bennett's elemental burst or Toma's elemental skill or burst, one of them applies pyro to you. But when you do one of those things while you have the electro applied to you, it isn't going to stun lock you and throw you backwards. At least in my testing, it didn't. Same with like Barbara in her applying the wet status to your character. It doesn't seem to stun lock you in the same way it would when an enemy actually applies those elements to you. So keep that in mind for teammates you might be pairing with her. Also wanted to mention energy hungry characters and how good they are with Dori. Characters with 90 cost bursts like Yae Miko and Raiden Shogun, or maybe a future character up and coming, are going to be pretty good to pair with her, not only because she'll help fund their elemental burst, that is a very high cost, but they'll give that elemental resonance with the electro elemental resonance that further increases the amount of energy that they get. And if you have a character like Raiden Shogun who already funds the team's energy, then you're never going to have to worry about your energy being lacking for your team. Well, I do think that's going to be about it for this video. I hope you guys enjoyed, and I hope it helps you build your Dori, as I think she is a pretty complicated character to build to make her not just a worse Kuki Shinobu, and I think we managed to accomplish it here. And I'm actually enjoying playing her now that I was able to make a build that let her contribute in a different way. But let me know if this actually helped you out, helped you build your Dori, and if you're going to be building her differently at all, or if maybe you just want to go for the consistency Dori. I'd like to see all of that in the comments below. But other than that, I hope you guys have a fantastic rest of your day. My name's Blossums, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.